So good evening everyone, I'm David Hooks. Some of you might know me from Twitter as PoliticsScot, and the rest of you are probably wondering, who the hell is that guy? Well, I've been a blogger, vlogger and independent supporting keyboard warrior since about 2014, but this is the first time I've been asked to speak anywhere, so if I mess up, please forgive me. The given topic was media, and it's a subject I'm really interested in, as you can tell from the video you just watched. But that was by no means all my own work. I didn't write the script, it was a team effort, and it was the last in a series of pilots trying to show the bias of the BBC. Now, I can remember vividly the day that I lost faith in the BBC, and I'm pretty sure that for most of you it will probably be the same day. I'd been following the debates and news stories avidly, almost to the detriment of doing my own day job, but I was able to watch and listen to the infamous Nick Robinson moment. I shuddered quietly in the corner with silent laughter as Alex Salmond masterfully took apart the now former political editor. And later, when I got back home, just in time for the BBC bulletin, I sat there with a wee smile on my face, just wondering how Nick was going to spin this one. And when his voiceover said the words, "he didn't answer," I jumped off the couch and shouted at the TV, almost busting a vein in my neck. I, like most of you, had sat and watched the full 6-minute answer, and whether you want to debate if he answered the specific question or not, he definitely answered. He simply refuted the premise of the question, as any politician would do with such an aggressive inquiry, asking why people should trust Alex Salmond over business leaders in charge of billions of pounds, forgetting, of course, that Mr Salmond was, at the time, the First Minister of Scotland and in charge of a £30 billion budget, 5 million people in a country with 140 billion GDP. But the claim that he hadn't answered stuck. When I was growing up, I trusted the BBC. I saw it as the one bastion of truth in a world of biased news and state propaganda. Oh no, our BBC's not like that, it's different. But that moment shattered an illusion. Once you've peeked behind the wizard's curtain, there's no going back to believing in magic. The BBC were phenomenally adept at soft propaganda, bias presented as balance. But during the independence referendum campaign, they showed their hand as a mouthpiece of the British state, and it's almost impossible to see them as anything else afterwards. The clue was always there. The first B stands for British after all, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The audience plants of Tory and Labour councillors or Britain First activists in Question Time, the interrupting of SNP guests while 3 unionists are allowed to make their points unhindered, the antagonistic style of Jackie Bird interviewing independent supporters versus pro-union politicians and commentators. Hundreds of small pieces of bias are present in our media, and most people are completely oblivious to it, at least consciously. Just this past weekend on the BBC's Sunday Politics show, there were several instances of overt and subtle bias. From the way they spoke about Alex Salmond's show and only talked about where it was being broadcast, rather than discussing who was on the show, or the fact it was a huge coup for the former First Minister to get Catalonia President Charles Puigdemont on as a guest. To the interview with Keith Brown, where Gordon Brewer did his absolute best to suggest Scotland was rubbish for wind power and that we weren't the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy as promised. Never mind that energy policy is ultimately reserved to Westminster. Never mind the £1 billion carbon capture scheme that was cancelled by the Conservatives. Never mind the subsidy cuts made at the last minute that caused wind farm projects to be cut and cancelled. No need to put facts into context. Context isn't something the BBC are keen on, unless it suits their own agenda. And they always like to end on a negative comment from a unionist guest with, "and we'll have to leave it there." Look out for these little lines that they can't help but add, like when they talk about the number of children from deprived backgrounds that get to university. But they never discuss the differences between SIMD and POLA, the 2 different systems of classification in Scotland and England, to determine an area's level of deprivation, or the fact they're not directly comparable. They never discuss the fact UCAS figures don't include all higher education places in Scotland, but they do point out the bits of a report that suggest the Scottish Government aren't succeeding. And are always happy to mention that Nicola Sturgeon asked to be judged on education. So they'll discuss a set of PISA scores from 2015 which showed a decline, but they won't talk about a similar decline in England and Wales and other Western countries, or the fact that the way the PISA test was administered changed from paper-based to digital. They will discuss a set of Scottish survey of literacy and numeracy statistics if they happen to show a drop, but they won't tell you that the literacy survey took around 5 randomly selected kids from each school to determine the progress of the whole country. Some have even alleged that the councils deliberately chose certain pupils for the test to skew the results, but we'll have to leave that there. Now, hands up who's worked in the financial sector. Don't worry, you're not going to be huckled out following an angry crowd bearing pitchforks. I just want to see how many people have gone through money laundering training at work. Because what I wanted to discuss with you here today is how the media use the techniques of money laundering to insert the ideas and information we've talked about into the public consciousness. Now, yes, I know that sounds a little bit mental, and so is my auto cue. Excuse me, sorry. It's all going a little bit here. Into the public consciousness. Now yes, I know that sounds very tinfoil hattish, and whenever people criticise the media, they're labelled as extremist or fascist. Trump may be a racist cheesy what's-it, but he tapped into something that's perfectly real and valid. The view that our media are biased and misinforming us wasn't his. It was something that a lot of people all over the world feel. The delegitimisation of the media hasn't been done by any one individual person. It was done by the media themselves. Fake news isn't new. Propaganda has been around as long as language has. He simply tapped into a view that the press can no longer be trusted. That their agenda wasn't to present the truth, but presenting the news people want, or at least the news that certain people want you to hear. That's how you... Excuse me. Because people do read the news they agree with and avoid the news they don't agree with. That's how you end up with papers like the Daily Hate Mail and the Express, and channels like Sky News. So money laundering is the act of taking dirty money from criminally acquired sources and making it clean. The media take pieces of information that suit the agenda they want to present and make it believed. For those who aren't aware, making fake money or information real is a three-stage process. There's placement, layering, and integration. In the financial world, placement is where money is first put into the system, maybe buying an expensive watch or putting money into an account. There are limits which trigger investigations, but as long as you stay within the limits and stay below the level, nobody looks too deeply. If you know the right places to hide the money, nobody asks any questions at all. Just ask the Queen. Then there's layering, moving the money around, performing multiple transactions until the initial source of the money is lost. Then we have integration, taking this layered money back out as legitimate gains, maybe through share dividends or a return on an investment. It's basically Bitcoin's business model. And these same techniques are used by our media. They decide what the news is, they set the agenda, they control the narrative, and with the exception of large-scale events, they control the news you hear. But who are they? It's not a secret cabal who meet every night and decide what the news is going to be tomorrow, and yet somehow the same phrases manage to work their way in, the same story appearing in more than one news outlet. Does everyone remember when the same bogus Labour press release somehow managed to be reported by several different papers? Not one of them bothered to check the veracity or accuracy of the information. They just took the press release, wrote it up into a story and presented it as news. This is placement. It's part of a system. It's about how things are done. It's not even always intentional. It's more just a learned behaviour. This is how the job is done. We only have to look at Aidan Kerr of STV and his style of newscasting to see that learning the job from someone who is biased can infect your own work. If he had learned from anyone other than Stephen Daisley, would he be so overtly biased? Think about it. We all act at work in a way that we think will help us to fit in, to not rock the boat. If being in support of independence was likely to hamper your professional progress, would you let anyone know you were a yes voter? But placement is about more, though, than just the first act of telling the story. It's also about where you put the news, which story is a headline, which one takes a back seat. There is, of course, always going to be news that's positive for the Scottish Government, so how do you handle that? Well, there's a couple of ways. One is to present the initial positive story, usually by referring to the SNP or Nicola Sturgeon, rather than using the terms Scottish Government or First Minister, and always followed by the words, "but critics say," and some negation of the original positive story. Either with the words, "does not go far enough," "despite delays," or by pointing to some other part of the world where more progress has been made. Bias presented as balance. It's like when you tell your dad that you got 90% on a test and he asks what happened to the other 10%. Sorry, Dad. Rather than pushing you to do better, it just leads to a feeling of what's the point in trying if it's never good enough? And that seems to be the ultimate agenda, as long as there's an SNP government in place trying to persuade Scots that they can and should do better. There are many examples of this kind of placement, but one which struck me was the day that the First Minister was announcing the launch of the new social security system. A major step in changing the welfare system of this country to be a kinder, gentler, more dignified service. Surely this would be the headline in any national broadcaster. There'd be a long, detailed piece with interviews with benefit claimants talking about what it would mean to each of them. But in fact, the lead story that day was about a bus having hit part of the Western General Hospital, causing a few minor injuries but no fatalities, and with all but a minimum of disruption. There was an interview with someone who'd been on the bus, and the whole story was several minutes of the main news. Now, it was certainly news, but the lead story on the same day as a new social security system was announced? Social security piece would be second, though, right? No, it was item number 6 and lasted for all of 20 seconds with a 5-second piece of footage of Nicola Sturgeon and some leaflets. In other words, the cameras were there, the footage was shot, and it was decided that the bus story was more important. So placement takes two forms: the initial introduction of a narrative and the decision of where to put the story. If that's a positive story for the Scottish Government, or indeed a negative one for the Tories, it tends to be either glossed over, not mentioned, or hidden away in the website under UK, Scotland, Glasgow and West. Just like the recent launch of the Glen Savick, the UK's first LPG-powered ferry, despite delays. If it's negative for the Scotland or SNP or independents, it's front and centre. And now we move on to layering. Layering in this context is the constant repetition of phrases, similar stories and confirmation bias to build a narrative. So the print media and the TV will use phrases like getting on with the day job again and again. They will take any opportunity to discuss the drop in oil price, but never a price rise. They'll talk about negative education results, but never the positive ones, or at least not without a but critics say. They'll pick up on a Scottish Conservative attempt to highlight 600 instances of emergency calls not picked on properly, but it took a guest on GMS to point out that only 75 of them were emergency calls and the rest were non-emergency calls or emails. They constantly refer back to the same cases to suggest things haven't improved, but that same guest gave statistics which showed that those missed interactions represented less than 0.1% of all calls. And just yesterday, on Reporting Scotland, the narrative that the Scottish Tory MPs are more effective than the SNP was given yet another layer with the Chancellor's announcement on VAT for the police and fire services. The BBC in Scotland dutifully broadcast the clip of the Chancellor giving credit to the unseen 13 and blaming SNP obstinates. No mention that the merging of the police forces was Tory policy too. No mention of the previous Scottish Tory objection to removing VAT. No mention that this means the Tories were playing politics with people's lives. And now we come to integration. I don't know if any of you are activists or have done any canvassing, but if you are, this part you'll definitely recognise. Integration is when media lines start being parroted back from the public who don't really know where the information came from or how they know it, but they do. Oh, the NHS is terrible, they'll say. Education in this country's a shambles. The SNP lot need to stop banging on about independence and get on with the day job. And then you ask their personal experience, and it's, oh, well, no, I was fine, or, well, Auntie Jean got diagnosed with cancer, but she was rushed straight in, but it's still, or, well, my nephew got on well at school, but the system's a mess. It's not quite brainwashing. Most of the people who say these things can be easily convinced that they're wrong just by showing them a few facts. But all too often these facts are only available on Twitter or Facebook, where there's an equal or greater amount of misinformation too. And there lies a big problem for the Future Yes campaign. Now we can see how all these techniques were used in the video that you saw at the start, how a narrative can be built and how integration happens. But there's one more type of bias that we need to discuss, and that was at the heart of that piece, and that's bias by omission. How the media avoid telling the stories that don't fit the narrative. How they report the news and then hide it. How they report Ruth Davidson attending Cabinet but not Nicola Sturgeon speaking at international events. The Tory councillor in child porn, Dutch fishing rights to Scottish waters after Brexit, 120,000 deaths linked to austerity. None of them reported on the BBC television news. We asked in that video for you to imagine what would happen if the accused was an SNP, MP or MSP, but we quickly found out with the treatment of Mark MacDonald that the suspicions were absolutely correct. He was doorstepped just as we described, in a way Alex Rowley wasn't and Ruth certainly wasn't. So what to do? Disengage, ignore the news, not pay licence fee? No. Talk. Bypass the media. Combat the narrative. I once heard the Indie Live guys say, don't hate the media, become the media. It inspired me to do vlogging. It's extremely difficult to do when you have a full-time job. It takes a lot of time and effort, researching, reading full Audit Scotland reports and not just the headlines. One 10-minute video that I did on the Forth Road Bridge took around 12 hours to produce, from reading the reports, reading notes of committee meetings, cross-referencing, filming, editing, combating the narrative that it was all the SNP's fault. It turned out that I was right, and the video got over 1,000 views, which I was very proud of. I've done videos on the misinformation on college places, the problems with GERS, how SRIT was a trap, some with more than 10,000 views, which to me is amazing thanks to people pushing them and making them, sharing them. But it's not enough. We have Truly Scottish TV, we have Scotland's Future, Yes Scotland's Future, Wings, James Kelly, Pete Warrior, Leslie Riddoch, Angela Haggerty, Paul Kavanagh and the other speakers that we're going to hear from tonight. But how many get time on the mainstream media? How many overtly pro-independence newscasters, presenters or column writers can you name? It's absolutely right that a media should hold its government to account. And it's also perfectly understandable that the state broadcaster of any nation would be a little bit biased towards its nation. But there lies the problem. Scotland doesn't have a national broadcaster. It has the British national broadcaster and STV, an arm of ITV. We often note that the Channel 4 News is less biased against independence, but only mildly so. I listen to Good Morning Scotland, I listen to BBC Radio Scotland Drive Time Show, I watch Reporting Scotland, and I can tell you that apart from being a bloody torture, it's also enlightening and scary in equal measure. We who criticise and call out the techniques that they use are labelled conspiracy theorists and cybernats. But whatever great individuals there may be working in those organisations, there is no doubt that our media is institutionally biased against independence. And that means that anything for positive for Scotland is negated, neglected or nullified unless it comes from Westminster. Screaming at the TV or shouting at the radio is not going to make a difference. We need to find a way to get together and create our own media, something which is truly accountable to the public and properly impartial. We need to get old school. We need meetings like this, town hall meetings with interesting speeches up and down the country. We need people like you, all of you, to go out and speak to your friends, speak to your work colleagues, speak to your older family members who inexplicably think that the Express and Mail are actually newspapers. Tell them the truth, show them the links to the evidence, combat the narrative, don't hate the media, become the media. Thank you for listening.